How is everyone? Doing well? Not too tired? And, so I wanted to say something about, I know that the lecture yesterday wasn't as comfortable for you as the 2 lectures before, right? Am I correct? Yeah? It was a bit hard because you didn't, so you know the thing is that Robert before had covered like things like R star, P star, so you kind of had some background, right? And then yesterday I launched into a lot of things that you hadn't maybe heard before, and equations maybe you hadn't seen before, and it was a little bit harder to follow. But I think, tell me your name again.
Guilherme.
Guilherme, yes, okay. He was making this really good point yesterday. It's like, he said, we're not supposed to focus on the details, but the bigger picture. And I think that's entirely right. In fact, I'm stealing your words now to disseminate it to the entire audience. What I want to say is like, yes, when I was your age, I hadn't even heard of this stuff. Well, if you were an undergraduate, that is. Even a master's student, I hadn't heard this stuff. So, and some stuff did not actually even exist at the time. So I want to sort of you to do this. Think of this as a challenge. You know, if you're faced with a challenge and you ran away from it all the time, you're going to miss out on a lot of things, right? So when you're faced with something unfamiliar, you could do 2 things. You could say, I'm going to withdraw from this and check my phone, or do something else, or I'm going to kind of, see what this is like. So I would like to ask you to do this. I would like you to do this person who came up a long way away. I'm kind of like a little blackmail here, but to sort of give this person the courtesy of 90 minutes of your time. I'm going to ask you, not telling you, to put your phones away and just try to engage. And let me ask you this. Do you know what daydreaming is?
What?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, what do you reach for what's the first thing you reach for when you wake up in the morning? So before these things existed, when people didn't have electronic gadgets to distract them, they distracted themselves through a process called daydreaming. Somebody's droning on, like me, I'm droning on about equations, and you just drift off to think about the love of your life or what you're going to have for lunch, and before you know it, you've missed a good chunk of the lecture. Like, what is it there? 15 minutes is like how many TikTok videos is that? I have no idea, I've never seen TikTok. But, the British call it, I like this one, wool gathering. See, you're learning 2 new things here. Right? This is what people used to do when they disengage from something, right? You're not paying attention. So I cannot stop you from daydreaming or wool gathering, but I would like you to try that. Put your phones away, but try to pay attention too, okay? To the extent you can. Everybody drifts off, right? Everybody drifts off for a bit. But the reason I'm saying that is it may seem like, okay, I haven't heard these things before. I have not seen these equations before. I don't know these ideas or these words or these terms, and therefore I'm not feeling comfortable with this. I'm going to tune out. But I think the challenge here is to get out of your comfort zone. What's the fun in life if you just always say, I play safe all the time, right? So just plunge into that and say, okay, I really am not comfortable with this, but I'm going to go out of my venture, out of my comfort zone, and sort of see how that goes. So when I started teaching about 2 years ago, class in evolutionary ecology, and this had a lot of like quantitative genetics, adaptive dynamics, and the thing was none of the students had really had a background in the grad students, and I told them the same thing. You're going to get out of your comfort zone. Just get out of your comfort zone. The whole class, there was no choice, right? But at the end of it, they were really excited and happy that they'd done it. Every single cohort told me that. And I have one of my graduate students, PhD students from Brazil, who just graduated last year, is Guilherme. he was telling me, he came to, we met when I first came, and he's saying, my gosh, I'm so happy I got out of my comfort zone to study, take your class, right? So I think like in a smaller way, that was a whole term, but in a smaller way, let's try to do that today. And this means, since you're out of your comfort zone, you can just say, I don't understand, or I don't feel comfortable, or you can ask questions, and we can go as slowly as you like. Well, maybe not as slowly as all of you like, but to a certain level, because I'm already behind with my 5 lectures, but I don't really care about that. If I can cover this what I call my 3rd lecture about temporal variation, actually I'm only still in the middle of the 2nd lecture, but 2nd topic. So this is what I would like to ask you to do today, okay? So just pay attention to whatever you're writing down with respect to this, and the rest of the time, you can take your pick, okay? Just do it the old-fashioned way. All right, so now I have to do this thing. We went through this. I'm going to flip so that you just see what we did. We talked about this exploitative competition in a spatially heterogeneous environment. We developed a model. We non-dimensionalized it. And we came up with a simpler model. We had this Jacobian. We came up with this invasion criterion, which had a lot of products and sums and the negatives, adding negatives to positives and positives to negatives. But we found out something interesting. And something you hadn't known before, right? Something you hadn't known before. So you never know. You might think, gosh, I don't study any of that stuff, right? Why is this relevant? But you would never know. When the day comes, you read something, somebody says something to you, or you interview for grad school, for PhD, and somebody says, what are you interested in? I really kind of like the idea of the storage effect. And they're going to be like, you're going to be in right there because you knew what that was. So I'm not saying to be manipulative about it. You had better not say you like the storage effect if you can't explain it. That would be very bad. But what I'm saying is, somebody might say something, you're reading something, you say, oh my gosh, that person who came, back then said something about this, let me go check my notes, right? You will never know the kinds of doors that open for you when you sort of venture into the unknown and you learn something. Okay, so this is what I'm asking you to do. Because I looked at my notes, I thought, well, it's going to get a bit more involved. But these are ideas, and I went to a lot. So the storage effect is not understood even by senior professors in ecology. You'd be surprised. And I went to a lot of trouble, really a lot of trouble for these lectures to make it so that practically anybody can understand it, okay? Even a high school student. Right? In a way that the ideas come forth and not like all the statistical stuff, the covariances, the variances, blah, 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 okay? Because that's what trips people up. So I hope you will sort of get the gist of it, because I don't think you'll get any simpler or more concise or more informative. I mean, I don't mean to sound arrogant about it, but I understood it. It took me a very long time to understand it without separately from the actual equations, which made it very confusing. Okay, it will be a while before we get to that, but because we haven't finished spatial variation. So we talked about exploitative competition, and I do want to go to the next topic under spatial variation, which is about mutualistic interaction. So these are like plant pollinator, plant seed disperser, plant mycorrhizal interactions, and in these, the very defining feature is that local dynamics involve positive feedbacks. So something like an alley effect, but the alley effect is induced by the interaction itself. So for example, a plant is relatively rare, and then the pollinators cannot find it. The plant can't reproduce, it gets even more rare. So both species eventually then go extinct if the pollinator has no other plant that it depends on for food, right? Now the thing is that alley effects are detrimental because they can increase the extinction risk when there are anthropogenic perturbations like habitat fragmentation. Say there's a species that's perfectly, it's doing perfectly fine. Its population growth rate is positive or it's at some steady state, But then if it has a tendency towards an allele effect when rare, like a mutualist pair, then fragmentation could reduce population sizes to a level that becomes important. So you see that this actually has huge practical value. And the thing is that we know about the global decline of bees and the consequences of that, and the problems with plant mycorrhizal interactions when you have excess nutrients in the soil and pollutants, contaminants. And so this is a really important, so if you feel like it's not an esoteric, elitist, conceptual thing, it actually really matters, okay? Right, so I'm going to illustrate this with a model which is kind of the worst case scenario. So you have an obligate mutualism. What is an obligate mutualism? Both partners are completely dependent on the other. Neither, so they're specialists, right? Essentially they're specialists on, so that there are like the Hawaiian honey creepers, you know, those like beautiful long beaks. They can only take nectar from a particular kind of plant that has the kind of corolla. So if the plant were not there, the bird cannot survive. And if the bird were not there, you can't actually get pollinated with that kind of long corolla length unless you have a species with a very long curved beak, right? So you see that those are actually in danger for precisely that reason. And we are going to consider a pairwise interaction consisting of a mobile species and a non-mobile species. So obviously like a plant and a pollinator. And the interesting thing is we consider the dispersal of the mobile, I mean how it disperses, when it disperses, the whole dispersal mode of the mobile mutualist. And now this is a different model from what you've seen before, so pay attention. So this is a patch occupancy model. So here instead of actually looking at abundances, we are going to look at the presence absence. So we quantify the abundance of a species by the proportion of the patches where it persists relative to the total number of patches. So that's always a ratio, a proportion from 0 to 1, right? Okay, so this, we have 3 types of patches. Well, they are empty patches. They are suitable habitat, but neither the plant nor the, I'm going to call this the plant and pollinator just for ease. No species is present. You have patches in which the plant can persist on its own. Yes?
I'm sorry, this is not related to the class, but there seems to be some kind of interference sound in the mic. It's making it really hard to pay attention, for me at least.
But I have no idea how to.
I think we need to send a message to Natalia or something.
It's not from here, is it?
Like Jacob.
Is it better
Natalia,
now?
if you're listening.
No, there's a background thing, right? Yeah. There's an echo. Yeah. But there's also like a ee.
Yes.
Okay. You send a message.
Okay, and Natalia, if you're listening to us, please.
You're not telling me the whole building is listening to this. No. Okay, well, I'll just say a little bit. So, I am not hearing that thing now.
Yes, I can hear it.
So there are patches with just the plant. How is that possible? Because the plant, oh no, you're not Natalia, obviously.
I think I increase a lot the volume.
The volume, yeah.
Just
They can hear like airplanes flying now, so.
let's see, I'll lower down.
Okay, thank you. How's that? Much better, eh? Now you're not hearing stuff from the airport. I'm joking. Okay. Yeah, there was like a distress signal. Okay. We could be doing that all day. Okay. So there are some patches with just the plant, because the plant can survive in the absence of a pollinator, right? It just can grow, it just cannot reproduce. So there can be plants with just the, patches with just the plant, but not the pollinator, because obviously the pollinator's survival depends on the plant, because you know, pollinators are not there to like say, hey, I'll help you by carrying your pollen. They actually eat it. Or like they drink nectar, or they eat the petals, right? So so if you can't get your, it is incidental really. The pollination is something they do when they kind of walk around. or do something. So basically they cannot, but then you can also have the plant pollinator patches. So we can write down equations for the, so let's say P1 is the proportion of the patches occupied by the plant only, P2 is the proportion occupied by both the plant and the pollinator. So the equation for the plant only patches is empty patches are colonized by the plant, and that's given by that function, and it's a function of both P1 and P2. Why? Usually how do you colonize? If it doesn't reproduce, it's not going to go somewhere else, right? So in order for these plants to go colonize other plants, and other patches, it has to be reproducing in excess of, the capacity of that patch. And then when the pollinator colonizes those patches, right, that's given by this function. So these patches decrease because when they are colonized by the pollinator. You understand, this is a patch occupancy model. This is just like your SIR model. It's a set of transitions. You have empty patches, right? Empty P1 plus P2, sorry, P1. I don't like this eraser. Oh, okay. P1 plus P2, right? This happens when P1 gets in. This happens when P2 gets in, right? And this function is given f P1, P2, because honestly, the plant can't go if plant cannot actually colonize other patches unless it's reproducing within its focal patch. And this is, we say, G, P1, P2. And of course, when any plant-only patch is colonized by the pollinator, the number of plant-only patches decreases, right? So that's here. So you have a decrement because of the transition to the other state. And then there are some extinction probability. Yes?
I don't know if I got it wrong, but I heard that the plant population is going to decrease when the pollinator...
No, it's not the population, it's the patches. Now you have to think about the patches that are occupied by the plant. So this is just a habitat patch. So there is a proportion of patches, say there are 100 patches. 25 of those patches, so 50 of those patches are occupied by the plant only. And then anytime when the pollinator comes into that patch, it becomes a plant plus pollinator patch, right? Which means the plant only patches now have decreased by the same number that the pollinators have colonized. So it's a transition. Like how you go from susceptible to infected, and then the number of susceptibles decrease. It's the same idea, okay? So then, this is very simple for the plant pollinator patches. It increases at the rate at which the plant patches are colonized by the pollinator, and it has a background extinction. So there is some independent, the patch can go, so here's the thing you have to now switch your mindset to. Before we looked at, so remember first lecture? We were looking at populations, right? We never specified the spatial extent of it. So they always occupied some locality, some patch, but we did this, right? Now we are saying we are not going to actually look at the population size. We are just going to ask 0, 1, is it occupied or not? It's binary now, okay? Understand? So we are, because you see, when you study these things, especially for conservation, you can't always go and census every single patch to see how many individuals there are. Say forest fragments, it's really difficult. Try doing that for birds, for example, or frogs. So what you do is you go survey to see if there's at least one individual present or a few individuals, what your threshold is, and you say that's occupied. And then if you don't find anything, that's empty, right? So that's a lot easier to do. You could do it like survey from a helicopter, for example, for certain things. So this is really a method that was developed when you have a paucity of data, scarcity of data, okay? So we assume this stuff is going on. Yes?
it's more of an ecological question, I think. But is there a way to define precisely what a patch is, or should we?
This is what's called a spatially implicit model.
Okay.
We don't have any coordinates, you could do that on a map. So if you're studying something in real life, you could go and get your GPS coordinates. And here we are thinking what's called a spatially implicit, meaning space is implied, the structure is implied. Only thing we are concerned about is that there are patches exist. The distance between them we are not at this point considering. Okay? Yeah.
Just one thing that I didn't understand. Why from the empty patch to the P1 patch, you still have P2 in the function?
Because the plant cannot spread to another patch unless it can reproduce, right? Yeah. So in order to reproduce, it needs a pollinator. Are you happier now? Okay. All right. Good, good, good. All right. So now, for some of the more biologically complex questions, I'm going to say this as a qualifier. It's the simplest possible model. So we have only what we consider the most necessary elements of biology, okay? Just to speed things up a little because I'm getting a little worried about how much we can cover. So this one is like really simple. That way we are not looking at population size. We're just looking at occupancy. And you can also kind of ask questions about like, is that really realistic? Like, you know, we are not actually considering the distance, but this is the simplest possible thing you can do for a mutualistic interaction. And then we can ask questions about, okay, because I really want to get to the storage effect, and I'm still in the middle of yesterday's lecture. So, and we have this thing called a hierarchy. So this is really important, and this is what happens in nature. So this addresses some of your questions about the ecology. Spatial structure is really important. So we have this large spatial scale, the regional scale, which is a collection of local communities we call a meta-community. But here a patch is actually not a population. The patch is actually an individual. That should make you feel a little better, right? That's like a location. So this empty thing is like some patch of the soil, a seed falls in it, so that's the thing. Seeds are dispersed, right? So the seed falls in it, or the seeds are dispersed by wind, in which case they just go, but you still need a pollinator. So, oops, what happened there? Oh, there, okay. What was that? Hmm? Oh, Natalia, okay. Hey, don't do that. Okay. So a patch, okay, now think. A patch is an individual. A collection of patches is then a local community. So it's actually an individual level model, okay? So, and a collection of patches is a meta-community, okay? So then when we say a patch is occupied or not, what you're saying is some little space in the soil has a plant, but only a plant. It never is visited by pollinators. Or there's a little patch in the soil where pollinators actually come. There are flowers, for example, and the flowers are pollinated by whatever the pollinator is, say a bird or a bee or something. So here we have a phase diagram. You know what a phase diagram is like, so the state space, to describe the local dynamics in an isolated locality. What is a locality? That's a collection of patches, collection of individuals. Okay, now that thing is a population. Like, well, a community because you have more than one species, okay? So, now, this is the abundance of the plant pollinator patches because our state space is now P2 and P1, right? That's the abundance of the plant only patches. The straight line is actually, let me check. Oh, this is not today's lecture. The straight line is actually the plant pollinator patches. Oh, I have happily left that at home. And the curved line is the plant only patches, okay? So what you can see is that you have, so if you go back to the equations, the one more nonlinear is the plant only patch, right? Because it had two terms, F and G, each of which is nonlinear. and the plant pollinator patch is just a linear thing, like an input and an output. But the important thing is you see that the horizontal line crosses the curve twice, right? So what happens is you have two stable equilibria separated by a saddle point. That's the alley effect, right? When the abundance of P1 and P2 fall below this point, both species go extinct. And that's biologically easy to understand, right? If the plant is rare, pollinators don't visit, plants are rare, pollinators don't visit, and then plants don't get pollinated, they become even more rare, the whole system spirals down. And this actually happens in nature. This is how a lot of patches go, plant species go extinct. But if your abundance is above that, then you go to a stable equilibrium with P1 and P2. So, but that's the problem. There is, so in this model it's really interesting because this is a repeller, sorry, not a repeller, but a saddle. So it attracts in these two directions, but repels in this. And so this is very interesting because this alley effect arises solely due to the mutualistic interaction. There is no inherent tendency to have an alley effect in either species. So if you just took each species, you wouldn't see it. That's the beauty of it. This is an interaction generated alley effect, and that's why that turns out to be a saddle rather than a repeller, because if you wrote this out for a single species with an alley effect, usually that in unstable equilibrium is a repeller, meaning it repels in all directions. Here it attracts in one direction and then repels in the other, but the outcome is that you go towards extinction. Okay? Yes?
Could you explain again, please, what's the line, the straight line?
So these are the zero growth isoclines. So you set the equations to 0, and then you solve for P2, P1, and you get some expression and you plot it.
Yeah.
Okay? And then the curve, the parabola, is for the plant only patch. Remember, this is a little like the resource growth rate, right? Remember, the resource growth rate was the one that had the curve the last time, and then you have a horizontal line for the plant pollinator patches, right? So you know that when you have two zero growth isoclines, where they cross is where you have a steady state, right? Okay?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good. So, and then here this crosses twice because this is non-linear and it crosses twice. Okay? What would happen if that horizontal line were above the curve? There's no existence of a species interaction, right? Right. So this is what happens within a patch in the absence of any spatial dynamics, right? It's prone to extinction if species numbers fall below. So for example, there's something, I don't know, a thunderstorm, and then some plants die, and then you could have this problem if it's not connected to the other patches. Now, so the question we are asking is, can spatial variation counteract this alley effect and allow species to increase when rare? So now spatial dynamics here include dispersal between two of these localities. So I'm going to talk about a two locality model, but again this is generalizable to two species n locality model. So now you have, here's locality J, this is locality K, and how are they connected? They are connected by the dispersal of the mobile mutualist, which is the pollinator, and dispersal is completely random. Okay? So it has sort of equal probability of going to one or the other patches. So now, look at the equations now. If you look at the plant equation, this term is the same as before, except of course you have to, it's local, right? This is local dynamics, and the death rate is a function of its own, the patch frequency, right? These two are the same except for the notation. So do not ever get defeated by a notation. That's just saying, instead of saying 1, 2, and you write down 4 equations, we are just going to say P1 and P2 are the two patch types, and j is this locality, and k is the other locality, okay? And then I, when I have to say I, that is, I stands for 1 or 2. That's the identities of the species. Otherwise, I'm going to have to write 4 equations, and that sometimes is helpful. But then now the difference is we also had this before, right? It was a function of P1 and P2, but now we have this thing called I, and that describes the pollinator's dispersal. Okay? We haven't specified it, but that is a function or could be a constant. And then of course the only only difference is that in this function, because that's what the mobile mutualist is response. You know, this is just the colonization of the plant only patches by the pollinator, and then that pollinator can now move, instead of colonizing, instead of visiting plants in its focal patch, it can choose to visit another population, which pollinators often do. Even honeybees do that, even bumblebees do that, right? They go from patch to patch. So, and then of course how it goes, the mode of dispersal now affects that function g, and that keep in mind. So what we can already anticipate, perhaps having learned about what random dispersal can do in terms of feedbacks. Remember we learned something yesterday that dispersal can induce it. So we can almost anticipate, remember this patch has a linear zero growth isocline. You can almost anticipate, you think it will be the same now with random dispersal, the isocline. We might conjecture that it may be different, given that we learned yesterday that dispersal, even random dispersal, can induce a negative density dependent effect that's similar to intraspecific competition. Okay? That's just, so that's how you kind of connect what you learned yesterday to today. Yes?
I'm sorry, what is the capital I?
The capital I describes the pollinator movement.
Okay.
I am not, haven't explained it yet.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay? So it's just saying movement, this function is, this is now g is a function of I, and I'm going to describe it later. Okay? All right. So, in fact, I have abstracted that out, but I can give you the, okay, well, never mind. So, here's what you saw before, right? Local dynamics in isolation, species cannot increase when rare, right? Because of the alley effect. Now, when the patch is connected, what happened to that horizontal line? It did become nonlinear, and in a really nice way, because it eliminated the alley effect. See, what happened was this line is fairly similar here, but it went down, right? You see, this horizontal line became this. You see? Magic? No. So now species can increase when rare, okay? Because the pollinator's dispersal actually did something to make the pollinator's zero growth isocline nonlinear, okay? Yes, do you have a question?
This was something that was already asked, but still not very clear to me. What is the horizontal line exactly?
Sorry?
Can you explain again what is the horizontal line?
That is the zero growth isocline for the plant pollinator patches. Now, if you don't know what a zero growth isocline is, did someone not cover that? Yeah, so it's like, let me take a second to explain this. I kind of assumed that you would know that, so unfortunately I was given the impression. So a zero growth isocline is like this. So let's say, I'm just going to do a competition model, okay? Rn 1 minus n over k minus alpha n2 over k or something, right? Then a zero growth isocline is you basically set this to 0, and you solve for this in terms of n2 and n1, and you plot that in the space n1, n2. Okay? The zero growth isocline is the line on which the per capita growth rate of that species is always 0 for the combination of abundances of the two species. Okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't think to actually explain that, but I sort of had assumed.
No,
So,
we actually learned that, but
probably like what, the first week?
yeah, but I'm
so-
bad at memorizing names. I memorize concepts.
I'm sorry. So yeah, I mean, I'd be doing the same thing, like, okay, good. So that's good. So we are kind of on the same page, right? Okay. Now then, yeah, so wait, why am I doing it there? So here, dispersal, you see a recurring theme, right? Dispersal itself is density independent, but it generates this negative density dependent effect that actually counteracts the positive density dependent effect that's inherent in this mutualistic interaction that generates an alley effect. So you can see there's actually a huge qualitative difference in this system, right? Dispersal has enough negative density dependence to basically eliminate the positive density dependence, okay? So that's really the important message here, okay? So remember, so this is why I said, like, yesterday we learned about this thing, it was a bit puzzling for you, like, but you can see it's a very general phenomenon. It's a completely different model, right? This doesn't even have abundances, just as frequencies, but this actually happens. So it always happens because of that 1 over x kind of thing mathematically, but biologically what it does is you have these individuals coming in, and because the density of the contact is unrelated to the density of the individuals coming in, it generates this negative relationship between density and per capita growth rate. So here, so what is the mechanism of the this rescue? So basically what happens is these patches are rescued from extinction due to the alley effect through dispersal, right? So we want to ask what is the mechanism of this rescue effect. Oops, here. Now I'm plotting a different thing, okay? So here is the abundance of the plant pollinator patches, P2. This is the per capita growth rate in those patches. Remember, that is the patch that had and that's still the same, right? Per capita growth rate is actually independent of the density and, sorry, the frequency. But then in the isolated patch, when it's connected, we see something very similar to what we saw yesterday. You get this thing where the per capita growth rate is high when the abundance, the frequency of occupied patches is low, and is lower than this when it's high. So what that means is the species' ability to increase from small numbers, either because they are rare or they were abundant but were depressed to low density, is higher now, because first of all, it was before completely independent. You actually had the same rate, right? And then when you are abundant, there's stronger negative density dependence that regulates this system so that the coexistence equilibrium is more stable than it would otherwise be. Remember, there was a coexistence equilibrium even in isolation, but now it's strengthened because when it's perturbed, it can have a larger domain of attraction from which it can. Okay. So dispersal creates a negative density dependent effect that's similar to intraspecific competition. Per capita growth rate is high when abundance is low. That allows species to increase when rare. So this is the mechanistic basis of the rescue effect, that species dispersal increases the strength of intraspecific interactions relative to the strength of, that's the more general thing, because this is not competition, right? This is actually a facilitative mutualistic interaction, but it works the same way. And yesterday, I think the people who came to the discussion, we had I made a clarification. I'm not saying that dispersal generates intraspecific competition. Dispersal generates a negative density dependent effect like intraspecific competition, right? That's the thing. And it enhances the local density dependence due to intraspecific competition, right? So it's interesting to ask how you would test this, right? Do you know how you would test density dependence? Usually what you do is you measure the per capita growth rate versus density, and if there's a negative slope, either linear or non-linear. So in principle, you could do this in enclosures or something, right? You could just have the plant, and you can measure the per capita growth rate, plants and pollinators, and then you could connect two patches, and then you can ask whether it's more non-linear, right? Might be easier with like something like a plant, something simpler to manipulate, but it's actually doable, right? I mean, people have done harder things. So we have here the persistence of a mutualistic interaction via non-linearity that's induced by spatial variation, which generates this additional negative density dependent effect. And the important thing here is this allows the persistence of an interaction that could otherwise go extinct at low densities. Now, competition doesn't have that issue, right? Competition doesn't have a tendency to go extinct at low densities, but this one does. You have a question?
Could you go back one slide? Okay, there it says interactions and not competition.
Yeah, because we're talking about a mutualistic interaction now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was. Okay.
Yeah, so it applies to all interactions.
That's exactly what I was going to ask, but I guess.
Yeah. So no, that's a good point. So you have to pay attention to that, right? So I'm not saying mutualism or competition is actually a very general phenomenon. Okay. All right. Oh, yeah.
So in the diagram that you showed us for the patch dynamics, I believe that there was a term for the empty patches. They could be either colonized, but can the occupied patches just die out and become empty?
Yeah, because you have, remember the extinction term?
Yeah, but
yeah. So basically what happens is,
so my question about that is, why don't we keep track of the empty patches?
Oh, because it's it's one degree of freedom, right? It's defined by the other two.
But then
because if you know the other two, you don't need to know the empty patches, right? You would get it anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, because see so you could write 3 equations, but the fact is it's redundant, right? If you know, so like say if P1 plus P2 is equal to 1, you only need to know one of them, right? It's the same. So that's a good question though, because you could, so some in disease models, people actually write it out, all 3, but in these kinds of models, it's redundant because if you did write it, you would get the same thing, okay? You don't need an equation for the empty patch, but you could if you wanted, okay? Good point. Right, so here we see that the local dynamics alone have positive density dependence, but we see spatial variation in the per capita growth rate. I remember I said heterogeneity itself is not relevant unless it generates spatial variation in fitness, and we have dispersal generating negative density dependence, which if sufficiently strong can reverse the early effect. Okay?
I'm sorry, I still kind of don't get it. Was the previous slide saying that dispersal increases the strength of competition relative to
There's no competition in this model.
Not even the interspecific interaction there is also mutualistic. That's what I'm like?
Oh, you're asking, well, no. So there is an element of competition in the model because you have to, if an individual doesn't, good point actually, very good point. So there is an element of intraspecific competition because say that you have these spaces in the landscape and a seed falls and a plant, seedling emerges, like it germinates, the seed germinates. It's a matter of who got there, right? There could be other seeds that do not do that. So there is an implicit density dependence. We could write it out like that and have a whole lot of equations, but that would be a whole lot of equations. So what we say is, we just assume that there's like a patch, inside a patch you have the species going to carrying capacity, and that happens really quickly with respect to the time scale. And in fact, I should have mentioned this. That's good question, because yesterday I said dispersal occurs on the same time scale as local dynamics. Here we've abstracted out the local dynamics, so an individual just grows into a plant, right? We've just abstracted that time scale out, and we say, but we are really paying attention to the regional scale. Remember when we were doing that yesterday, we were just saying, okay, kind of they are happening on the same generation time scale. But here now, we're just assuming a patch, you know, seeds grow, plants become, you know, they become shrubs or whatever they are, and then the dispersal process occurs on a somewhat longer time scale, meaning it's after obviously a plant. The plant has to reach reproductive age, right? So in plants, most of the competition comes at that seedling stage, right? So good point, okay. So there is an element of competition in the so when you say intraspecific interactions, generally these intraspecific interactions are self-limitation, right? Meaning intraspecific competition. Right. So we've been looking at, under this topic of spatial variation, coexistence through the possibility of coexistence through the interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation. And we've looked at two cases, one with competitive interactions where there's the R-star rule and there's competitive exclusion, and the second case is mutualistic interactions where you have an alley effect that produces. So in one case it's just exclusion, right? You get competitively excluded by the other species, but in the second case the entire interaction can go extinct when species fall to low numbers. Okay? So what we see is, in the first case we see that in a competitively heterogeneous environment, meaning competitive ranks are not the same everywhere. You get local competitive coexistence when there is dispersal. In the mutualistic interaction, negative density dependence induced by density independent dispersal allow the local coexistence of mutualists that could otherwise actually go extinct. So there is no effect, there's no problem of them coexisting in the sense like they need each other, right? The problem here is rarity. So it's unlike competition. In competition, the problem is there is this other thing, other species kind of taking your resource away. In a mutualistic interaction, the species need each other. In competition, you actually want the other species to go away, right? Because it's a mutually negative. This is mutually positive. So look at the contrast. Mutually positive interactions are always prone to deterministic extinction at low abundances. So here, dispersal then is not just allowing it to coexist, but in the sense that they are occurring together, but allows for a very stable coexistence equilibrium. Yeah. Mike.
What is this DI?
Oh, density independent dispersal.
Independent dispersal.
Sorry, that's density independent. Density dependent, negative density dependence due to, I couldn't get it on the same line. So.
And another thing is like, I was thinking about what are we seeing, and it kind of remind me, like, I don't know exactly what I can say, but like the border effect or the
Edge effect? Edge effect, yes. So at the edges you might actually not see, you may not encounter like your pollinators, or because you're kind of being disturbed due to fragmentation or something. A little like that, yeah. So, but this alley effect would exist no matter where. Like even if you had an intact habitat, it's just a species, like if the plant, say, becomes rare, I don't know, due to a parasite or something, and then the pollinator has trouble finding it, it's going to go down. So that's the thing, okay? Good, yeah. So because there's actually a positive density dependence inherent in this relationship, but not in that one. Now where else did we see a positive density dependence? We studied 3 types, we have now studied 3 types of species interactions. There was another one where we saw a very different kind of positive feedback. It was only Monday. Remember the consumer resource interactions and the type 2 functional response? That's the positive feedback. That's the odd kind of positive feedback, which most people actually don't even realize exists. Okay. So we've looked at the interplay between nonlinearity and variability in the spatial dimension. So now I want to move to looking at the temporal dimension, which requires me to stop share and open another file. Stop sharing. Oh, go away. That's the anthem. Back to that one. So temporal, okay? So this is actually the last thing under this whole sort of, space and time are the most important things. So we see, so we are going to consider local nonlinearities under competition and consumer resource interaction. So we are now going away from mutualisms back to competition and consumer resource dynamics, okay? So temporal variation. So let's think about it. So temporal variation is generally a result of abiotic environmental variation. And I'm going to focus on temperature variation, not least because climate warming is really the defining environmental crisis of our time, and it's really important to get a mechanistic understanding of how individual organisms respond to temperature variation and then be able to predict how they might respond to climate warming, both in ecological time and in evolutionary time. So that's my motivation, so I'm going to focus on temperature variation. Okay? So storage effect, and was developed by Peter Chasson, and he looked like that. He doesn't look like that now. So he's very young, and he came up with this idea, I think when he was a postdoc, which is actually pretty phenomenal when you think about, because this has really been the dominant theme in ecology for the last however many years, okay, 40 years. So this is an idea that people have had a great deal of trouble grasping. The mathematics tend to be complex, but the idea is actually fairly simple. So even senior people, so I would say pay attention simply because it's such an important idea, and it actually pervades also population genetics. I mean, heterozygote disadvantage is a storage effect. So it's very, very, very general, and it is hard to understand. And so I'm going to walk you through it in the simplest possible way, okay? So what does storage mean? So we start from the beginning. The storage, everybody sorts of understands this, but this is not your storage when you leave your dorm and you put all your stuff in a storage, right? It's the gain in reproduction during favorable periods, which is stored in some way. So through adult, like if you're very long lived, you're sort of storing that through your longevity. That would be true in species with overlapping generations. You live longer because the times are good and you get lots of nutrition. Or like with dormant seeds of an annual plant. So the adult dies, but the seeds will lay dormant in the soil. They will lie dormant in the soil and then germinate when the environment is favorable. So the thing is that the gain in reproduction during favorable times can allow the population to survive the losses it suffers during unfavorable times. So you store the, so the good year, the beneficial effect of good years in some form of life history trait, either as adult longevity, if you have overlapping generations, you know what that means, right? Adults and parents and offspring are alive at the same time. Or if you are an annual organism, you leave behind a stage of offspring that lies dormant and therefore can survive unfavorable periods. So this favorable, unfavorable period thing in time is the crux of the matter here.
Diapause in insects could also be considered to be.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. So diapause in insects is the same thing as dormancy in seeds, right? So you kind of slow down and you tide over the bad period. So here's the idea. It's a really, really simple idea, okay? The mathematics sometimes actually the mathematics are not confusing, they're complex, and interpretation can then get lost in the flood of mathematics, okay? Basically what it means is that species experience little or no interspecific interactions like competition and predation when they are rare. We haven't worked out how this happens, but this is what it is. And experience mostly self-limitation, meaning intraspecific competition when abundant, okay? So that is what it is. We are going to go through and work out how that can happen, but that's really it. All the mathematics boil down to that. Basically, temporal variation affords a kind of the conditions under which species can basically escape interspecific competition and be abundant, but by virtue of being abundant, face mostly intraspecific competition, right? Because if there's nobody else competing with you, you have the resources to yourself, you become abundant and you're regulated by self-limitation. That's kind of like just basically the equivalent of having very little interspecific competition. But the question is in real life, how does that happen? It happens all the time is the answer, okay? It happens all the time in plants, animals, and so it's worthwhile understanding this, okay?
Sorry, just a second. So we're saying that when the abundance is little, the interactions are dominated by intra-specific interactions, right?
Interaction. So when you're rare, you don't experience negative interactions from other species. Yeah.
So in both cases, intraspecific competition is the most important.
Intraspecific competition is important for population regulation, right? Without that, you will get exponential growth. So the thing is, when you are rare, you escape negative effects from other species. When you're abundant, you are well regulated because mostly you have intraspecific competition. It's the best possible scenario, right? You avoid bad things when you're trying to increase, like meaning bad, meaning competitors or natural enemies. And when you're abundant, you're just competing with other individuals of your species. While that's bad, that keeps the population regulated so it doesn't overshoot and then crash to extinction, okay? Does everyone understand that in principle, right? So that's really all there is to it. Of course, the thing is we have to look at the different conditions that need to be satisfied. There are three components of the storage effect. So we are going to try to understand this. Before I go home, I hope that I can make you understand this, right? If I've done that, I've succeeded. So there are three things. And do not worry about the terms because we are going to go through this. One is called species-specific responses to environmental variation. That means each species has a characteristic or defining response to environmental variation. In other words, species differ, right? All species do not have the identical response, which we know they don't. The second one, this is the one that trips up everybody. There is negative or no correlation between the favorability of the environment and strength of interspecific competition. What that's saying is, when the environment is favorable, that's a high value of the environment, very low interspecific competition. So that's a negative correlation, right? Or there's no relation. Either thing is, do you understand? That's a very intuitive thing, right? When the environment is favorable to you, there's very little effect from the other species. Can you guess why there's very little effect from the other species?
Because of the storage. They're storing.
Because
I don't
the
know how to
environment is unfavorable to the other species, right? So we get to the storage part. Okay? So, and then the last part is if there is an so let's think about the year. If there's an unfavorable part of the year, that's when you do the worst, right? You have to have what's called buffered population growth, which is a way to tide over the bad times. That's when you go into diapause, dormancy. Somehow you have to kind of get through say the winter, for example, right? Everybody understands that. You have to have a life stage that can survive the unfavorable period, okay? All right. So those are the three things. That last one is kind of obvious, right? If there is a period that's not favorable, then you're not going to do as well, but you have to survive somehow. At least some number of individuals have to survive to the next, until the next favorable period comes, right? So those are the three conditions. So we are going to try to understand this. Really understand this. So the environmental variation we focus on is mostly abiotic here. Temperature, rainfall, soil, nutrient availability, pH, things like that. And here's the thing. The environment that maximizes fitness is not the same for all species. Say, for example, colder versus warmer periods of the year. Some species do better when it's cold, some species do better in it's warm, or like in space, you could have, say, like serpentine versus non-serpentine soil. Serpentine soil favors certain species. Most species are disfavored in serpentine soil, and most species occur in non-serpentine soil. So the fact is that fitness is maximized in different phases of the environment, because we are talking about time here, although this applies to space as well. Okay? And species then, that it follows that since their fitness is maximized at different environmental, types of environments, species will then differ in the way they respond to abiotic environmental variation, right? So some do better at warmer temperatures, some do better at cooler temperatures. Everybody is following? It's pretty simple, right? Right. So in order to have these species-specific responses, what you have is that an environment that's favorable to one species is then unfavorable to its competitors, right? If you've maximized fitness at different, in different parts of the environment, then by definition, what maximizes the kind of environment that maximizes the fitness of species 1 is not going to be the one that maximizes the fitness of species 2, right? So generally then, when species respond in a characteristic way to the environment, environmental variation, and that differs from the way other species respond, what happens is that what happens is that the favorable period of the environment for one species is not going to be the same as the favorable period of the environment for the other species. Now, we should have an example. So, for example, let's think of species that do better. They are kind of more cold adapted, like higher latitude species, or species that are warm adapted. So, by definition, the favorable environment for the cold adapted species is the colder months of the year, right? And the favorable environment to the warm adapted species is the warmer months of the year. But the warmer months of the year are unfavorable to the cold adapted species, just as the colder months are unfavorable to the warm adapted species. I can testify to that myself. As can you, I'm sure. Not cold adapted. So basically then what then happens is, during the favorable period, you mostly encounter members of your own species, right? Because that time is really bad. Now you're getting a glimmering of how this works, right? So basically then that guarantees that there will be very strong intra-specific competition when the environment is favorable, and little or no interspecific competition, because it's really bad for the other species now, right? Yes, question?
Just to make sure that everything is clear, when you say that the environment is favorable to one species, it's unfavorable to another, is it unfavorable to the other a priori, or is it unfavorable due to the competition itself?
No, no, it's unfavorable because you have distinctive responses to the environment. So this is really about your physiology. So this is an independent thing. We haven't got to competition. The way competition works is a result of, that's why this is the first criterion. Species exhibit different responses to environmental variation. So the environmental variation is something completely abiotic that will operate regardless, like say the variation in temperature, variation in rainfall, right? That's there no matter, you know, regardless of whether there are species or not. Then the question is, if there are species in a given locality, if they all respond to that variation in the same way, we are back to our star rule, right? Because they are all doing the exact same thing. But when this variation is temporal or spatial, if some species respond differently to some aspects of that spatial or temporal variation, and meaning that some period of time or some location in space is more favorable to them compared to the other species, then you will have this separation. Essentially, this is an idea, you minimize competition by being separated in space or time, right? But that's not enough. That's the thing. It's just saying that is not enough. Because that's what people just say, right? Well, you know, you are abundant during the colder part of the year, you are abundant during the warm part of the year, you are separated, you're not. No. Because there are lots of, you know, it doesn't mean that there is no competition. So you have to actually show that, because, you know, you could be a generalist, you could be warm adapted and be a generalist, there could still be overlap, right? So it doesn't really necessarily mean. So that's the thing. Is everybody happy with that, this idea? You get the sort of the gist of it, right? So the way you respond, so of course if all species responded the same way, there is no storage effect. But all species never respond the same way. You know this even if you study the singer community. They will respond very differently to soil moisture because they are adapted in different ways, right? And for temperature, there's thermal adaptation. Some species tend to be specialists, some species tend to be generalists, some are more cold adapted, some are more what. I'm going to give you an example with real data to make this clear later. So that's the first one. That's actually not that hard to understand. This correlation thing is that the thing that really flummoxes people. The correlation between environmental favorability and the strength of competition. For a very long time, when I was a grad student, I never had a class in any of this. I was really confused. What does he mean by competition? What does he mean by competition? And I realized actually he's left out the very crucial part. It's interspecific competition. That's the thing. There's the correlation between environmental favorability and the strength of interspecific competition. You can see that I wrote that down that way too because I wanted to keep it on 2 lines. He probably did the same thing, but it generated lots of confusion because then the whole thing fails if you're thinking intra-specific competition. No. So let's try to understand this. It's really simple. An environment of, okay, so start. An environment favorable to one species is unfavorable to its competitor. We agree on that, right? Which means you're going to experience little or no competition during the time that's favorable to you, but is unfavorable to your competitor. No brainer, right? Which means during the time that is favorable to you, you're going to grow, have lots of reproduction relative to mortality. Now you're going to become abundant, resource becomes limiting, and you're going to be limited by strong intra-specific competition. What's the advantage of intraspecific competition? It regulates the population at some set point like a carrying capacity. So if it doesn't overshoot and then collapse because individuals are overexploiting their resources, right? So you have population regulation. Population regulation is the ultimate fundamental mechanism that allows persistence coexistence. If a population is unregulated, it's exponential growth, they're going to crash at some point. Regulation, that's the fundamental requirement for all of biodiversity. And that's what's ensured by this difference in favorability, unfavorability of the environment, okay? So what that means is the to compute this correlation, what you're going to see is either there's no relationship between the strength of interspecific competition and the favorability of the environment, or it's negative. You see, right? So say you go and, so this actually, if you are going to do this, this is where it gets hard, because he showed statistically how you could measure these, and people got lost in the variances and the covariances. But let's say you can measure environmental favorability. I don't know, let's say it's temperature, right? And then strength of, so I'm going to say alpha ij, that's strength of competition. Basically the idea is, so let's say temperature increases, right? And competition strength decreases, right? So that, what is that saying? When temperature, so let's say, no. Let's say this is, okay, so let's say this is a species that's cold adapted, okay? So I'm going to put some numbers in Celsius, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. This is favorable, okay? I'm making this up. This is unfavorable, right? So then this is the strength of competition by the other species. Now for the other species, the favorability is the opposite. So this is species 1, okay? Then species 2 is right? It's the opposite, right? For the second species that's warm adapted, the favorable environment is the warm temperature. So it's doing badly, it's unfavorable. The cold temperature is unfavorable to it. What do you think the strength of competition here should be? Interspecific. Low. And it should be high. So what you have is low temperature, high temperature, right? So when the environment is low to high means this is favorable, right? So I'm going to actually do this. Let's just say so I'm going to give these points now. 50, 40, what I'm making this up, 30, 20, right? So the environmental axis is this way, and the competition is this way. You're going to get this, right? Because this is the low, sorry, low temperature. If I drew the temperature itself, it's not going to work because you're going from low to high. You actually want the inverse of the temperature, right? Because the favorable, so I'm going to say 10 means 50 points, right? Because that's favorability rating, right? So, but at that point, competition is almost 0, right? Do you see? I'm sorry, probably the diagram made it worse. But do you see what I'm saying, right? So you can measure the correlation if you measure the favorability of the environment and the strength of competition. How would you do that? Say it's a plant species. Let's say it's soil moisture, okay? So you measure the soil moisture, right? And there are dry periods and wet periods. This is very true in the American Southwest, like Arizona, where Peter Chesson spent lots of his, most of his career. And so you go and measure the soil moisture, and you then measure. In plants, this is easy. You put the plant on its own with the other thing, and you measure seed set, right? What are you going to find? If it's a plant that's drought tolerant, and its competitor is drought intolerant, what's the strength of competition during the dry period? It's high on the environmental axis, right? Because it's favorable to the drought. The dry period is favorable to the drought tolerant species. Do we agree? Right. The dry period is unfavorable to the drought intolerant species. What would be the strength of competition from the drought intolerant species on the drought tolerant species during the dry period? I can't believe I managed that sentence. No, right? Yeah. Are we happy now? Can we go to lunch? No, you have 15 minutes. Okay. Okay. I have to tell you, when I was younger, in fact, even now, I had set up the standard for excellence for myself by my ability to understand Peter Chason's work, because he's the most consequential ecologist to have come since Robert MacArthur. And that's saying a lot, because there he's in a group of very formidable peers, David Tillman, Robert Holt, I forget the others, but anyway, Simon Levin. So to me, because it's very dense mathematically, and because all this is, actually very formally, rigorously proved, it is such an important idea. It's not the only thing he's done. He has also come up with the scale transition. He has that sort of it's a very abstract thinker. The problem with abstract thinker, do we all understand Einstein? Do you all understand quantum mechanics? No, not really, right? We sort of do, but not really. So it's the same, right? So it's very abstract, and he writes in that abstract kind of way. He proves theorems. It's very inaccessible. But if you think about it, you sort of, it took me decades because there were no classes on this, or nobody understood it enough. And so I would go through, he has this paper from 1990, it's really hard, and there's one in 1994, it's really hard. They're like in theory journals, which tells you, right? But to my whole career, scientific career, this is my standard, because I think it's the most important idea. It's not even something I actually study, right? Although I will show you an example of where I did end up studying it. But it's really, really, really important. And you have to, okay, so the problem he has is he hasn't, especially early on, made it accessible to others. But I think, well, you can't expect the person to be that insightful, that mathematically savvy. He's a biologist who learned mathematics, not the other way around. And also to be very clear, and he's become clearer over the years. And now, the impact of his work is such that there are people making it accessible. There are papers with this explaining Chason, guide to Chason. There was one actually had something called the Chason lesson. And he would tell you the idiot's guide to, Chasonian ecology or something. So anyway, I'm just saying that because it's, okay, somebody's playing with my slides again. All right, we have one more. Okay, so we need to go. Please.
You can change it there.
What do I do?
There.
What do I do? Oh,
Natalia, please get this. Okay, thank you.
How does that happen?
It's because when you're talking to the class, or on the board, she wants the camera to be focused on you.
Thank you, Natalia. Okay. All right. So, okay. So we got through the hardest part. Wasn't that hard, right? Wasn't that hard? Oh, not that hard actually. When you explain like that, it's not that hard. You have any idea how much I worked on that? To get those slides correct, I tried it on people. Do you understand? And they're like, oh God, you make it sound so trivial. It seems so simple. Why hasn't everybody understood it? Anyway, so now buffered population growth. This is the easy part. So, gosh, species have to have a mechanism to survive unfavorable environments in space or time. Because, okay, it's great to have this favorable environment. I'm going to stay here. Favorable environment where you do well, but your competitor's not doing well. Now you have the good time, but now you need the storage, right? You store that advantage in some life stage that can get you through to the next favorable period, which will inevitably involve going through an unfavorable period, right? So, if you're an organism with overlapping generations, higher that longevity will do it because you will survive to the next year to reproduce again, right? Like a perennial plant, any animal, rodents, anything that lives more than a year. Dispersal can also do it in space, right? You store the good times by moving away from the unfavorable place and to a more favorable place. And then in time, you can either have higher adult longevity if you're an organism that survives between generations, like a perennial, or you could have something like dormancy in annual plants, where the seeds now, the adult dies after the seeds have been set. The seeds lie in the soil, dormant. They don't germinate during the bad time. They generally don't when it's cold, right? They need the cold thawing and all that stuff and photoperiod. And then they germinate the following year when, usually like spring, when it warms up generally, okay? So that's the sort of the easy part, but you see how important that is to the whole story, right? Each one is important. So let's sort of go through this now. We feel so much better about it, I hope. So species have these characteristic species-specific responses to environmental variation, of course, which is preceded by the fact that there exists abiotic environmental variation. That is guaranteed, right? Have you ever seen, I mean, just look outside. It's, the abiotic environment is always variable. And then, so then the condition here is that species differ in the way they respond to this environmental variability. And we see, because of those species-specific responses, the relationship between the favorability of the environment to a given species and the strength of competition it suffers from the other species has either no relationship or a negative relationship. That's the negative correlation. Okay? And the third part is, having got all that done, now you need to survive through the unfavorable period of the year. And that is done by what's called, you know what buffering means, right? You sort of are buffered by the good times so you can tide over the bad times. Like it's having a lot of savings when you get fired, so you can live on. I mean, in a very real sense, that's true, right? That's kind of, I want to just do a couple of things before we go to lunch. So you have, what you actually get is this spatial or temporal niche partitioning due to the storage effect, because that's not the only way you can get spatial or temporal niche partitioning. So you can think of the storage effect as a mechanism for temporal niche partitioning that's framed in terms of species responses to abiotic environmental variation. Now, why am I saying that? It's because it's not the only temporal niche partitioning mechanism. You could have two different resources that are available at two different times, or you could be partitioning a resource and a natural enemy like we did with intragroup predation, right? So there is actually here a hierarchy of mechanisms, and this is also like in the last lecture, remember we had a hierarchy of spatial scales, but this is what I told you, what I said about getting to the bottom of it. You don't just stop by saying, hey, I understand the three criteria. Now you want to step back from it and you can think about it. What does this really mean in the larger context of coexistence theory? So you have so temporal niche partitioning is a very general mechanism, right? In some ways you partition time. So you avoid interactions with your competitor. So storage effect is a form, provides a mechanistic basis for temporal niche partitioning. But the storage effect itself has a mechanism, right? And that mechanism is that the interplay between abiotic environmental variation and competition works in such a way that intraspecific interactions are stronger relative to interspecific interactions. And here it is competition, although the idea is general, as you saw before. Right. Now, the next thing that I want to do now, hopefully I can finish this tomorrow, is I want to now illustrate this. So you saw just, that was a verbal, conceptual analysis or like a presentation of the storage effect. I want to do an example based on a paper that I wrote actually with an undergraduate. If you can find this and maybe take a look before you come tomorrow. So the first author is Daniel Smith, who was an undergraduate in my lab when we did this work. He got this paper in the American Naturalist. And he's now a graduate student at the University of Chicago. American Naturalist. So he's got a lot of equations, but I ask you, and I want you to look at this, do not be bothered by the integrals or the things you see in these equations, okay? That's not the point. The point is I want you to understand how you might apply this theory to a real speech community and actually in the process learn a great deal about how you can get a mechanistic derivation of those competition coefficients. Everybody knows about the Lotka-Volter model, right? You have those alphas. Did you ever wonder where that came from? Like, is there a mechanism? It's just a phenomenological thing. You just like stick an alpha there and say how competition. We don't know anything about it. Can you measure it? Here what we are going to do is we are going to get a mechanistic derivation of the competition coefficient in terms of the temperature responses of resource consumption and mortality. Okay? And that matters because organisms respond to temperature variation. We have a real need to understand how organisms respond to climate warming. Okay? All right, I think we really worked hard today. We need chocolate after lunch. All right.